Hi, welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. Virginia is well known for its Civil War history. There were over 400 engagements and major battles fought in the state of Virginia. But there's more to the Civil War than battles and generals. There's a human element, and our guest today is Dr. Tom Lowry, who specializes in talking about people and unusual things they did. And Tom himself has an interesting background. Welcome to the show, Tom. And
thank you.
Can you tell us a little about your background and how you happened to get the history bug?
Well, I did medicine and psychiatry for 45 years and got interested in history. I found an old clipping which was an obituary of my great-grandfather, and it said, well, he had two brothers who were in the Civil War. And I thought, well, that should be easy to find out. Well, a year later, I found out you can't always find things easily. But the more I learned and the more I poked around, the more I found that there were all kinds of stories about the Civil War. And then I decided to read a book about the common soldier in the Civil War, because my ancestors were not famous generals or colonels or anything. They were just grunts, the guys that actually carried the rifles. And I read a book on the common soldier, and one of the things it said in the book was the sexual aspects of the war will never be written because all the material has been destroyed and the few people that have records will not allow them to be looked at. So I thought to myself, in my contrarian way, 35 years ago, is that so? And I had a cardboard box, and I would find things and throw them in this cardboard box. And when the box got to weigh about 25 pounds, I tried to write a book. And I was very pleased with the book, and it was turned down by 35 publishers. One of the publishers up in Pennsylvania said, well, it has possibilities. If you make the following 27 changes, we'll publish your book. And by the time I did all that, I'd really gotten the history bug. And it's sort of gone on from there. I gradually retired, and then starting 12 years ago, my wife and I started coming out to Virginia in the spring and in the fall and reading the Civil War court-martials. And then it sort of grew from there. And as I retired, we sold the house in California, came to Virginia, and eventually read all 85,000 court-martials. My wife put them all into the computer. My wife, Beverly, who has flying fingers on the computer.
How long did it take you to read 85,000 court-martials?
Roughly 10 years.
10 years, my. Well, you've certainly been a very prolific author. Researching your background, I've just been amazed at, the scope of your work. And one of the things you write about is Abraham Lincoln and the court-martials. The play, The Heavens Are Hung in Black, has just reopened Ford's Theater. And one of the big things in there is President Lincoln agonizing over the court-martials. Is that accurate?
Well, yes and no. I'm sure he agonized, but he agonized at high speed. He would sit down about once a week with the Judge Advocate General, Joseph Holt, and they would go over court-martials, and Lincoln would make his final decision and write a note in his own hand. Well, in a typical morning, they would do 35 of these. So he was agonizing at top speed.
Okay.
Knowing Lincoln and his productive mind, I'm sure he paid attention to each one. But it wasn't like he was pacing back and forth, banging his forehead, because he didn't have time to do that.
Right.
Outside the office, there was a big war going on.
Right.
Down the hallway was Mary having a conniption.
Right. Interesting. One of the things you write about, and I guess is our book in the center of our table here, is about sexual misbehavior in the Civil War. That you had millions of young men in the prime of life getting out there, and very little, as you mentioned, is ever mentioned in the literature about what they might have been getting up to. So how in the world were you able to research that and write about that?
Well, as I told you, I would start off with the information that you couldn't do it. And there was a lot in the court-martials, and then as the first book got known, people would send me things. They would say, I have this letter from great-grandfather, and I can't do anything with it, but you might be able to do something with it. So people flood me with material, very, very generous, helpful people. Some professional historians, some amateur historians, some people just had a bunch of letters from Grandpa. And so all that sort of came together. I learned all kinds of things which are surprising to me. Roughly 30% of all the brides were pregnant at the time of the Civil War. Well, that wasn't great news because you can do that from church records. If you look at the marriage date and the christening date and count on your little fingers, either there was this enormous epidemic of preemies or people were pregnant when they went down the aisle. Then I found from the records kept by the state medical societies who did surveys in the 60s, 1860s, which surprised me, roughly 30% of pregnancies ended in abortion. Moralists and preachers and so forth think this is a modern phenomenon, but it's not at all. In another way, the Civil War was far more sexual than today because on every street, every neighborhood, every village was a house of prostitution which was well known. Everybody knew who worked there. Everybody knew what it was. Everybody could give you, driving directions, as it were. And many of the court-martials mentioned this, not just for going there, but for going there without a pass, for going there after hours, for going there and getting into a drunken fight. And the usual court-martial had a board of 13 officers, and the witness would say, well, the stabbing occurred at Miss Jane's place. And the officer would say, oh, yeah, we know right where that is. So it wasn't like a secret.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, General Hooker, the Union commander at one point in the war, I mean, he's certainly given his name to ladies of easy virtue.
Well, that's one of the great incorrect stories of the Civil War.
Oh, really? Okay.
The term hooker for prostitute was in use at least 20 years before the Civil War and was fairly well known as a euphemism or a synonym for prostitute. Hooker liked women. He was a gambler and a drinker and liked women. And when he became commander of the Army of the Potomac to help things with the military police, because Washington was just a criminal mess at that point, he pushed all the houses of prostitution into one small area, which is now the Federal Triangle. And the newspapers immediately called this Hooker's Division. So that's where the two names got all hooked together. And forever after that, partially informed pundits have said that's the origin of the term hooker.
Oh, interesting. So were the Confederates more virtuous when it came to this kind of thing, or?
Well, the Confederates were very clever. Right before the fall of Richmond, they burned all their records. So we'll never know.
So we really don't know.
However, they did manage to burn all the newspapers. And the Confederate newspapers from Richmond are filled with arrests at houses of prostitution. They give the addresses, they give the name of the madam, they give some of the testimony when they were brought before the magistrate. Richmond during the Civil War was an absolute hotbed of prostitution, cross-dressing, all kinds of stuff going on.
Certainly not the kind of Scarlett O'Hara Civil War that we're used to hearing about.
Nope.
Interesting. You've got an interesting book about a fellow named Dorrance Atwater, who ended up in Tahiti. I mean, this seems like a very unusual story.
Well, it is, and it's a wonderful story, and the amazing thing is I'm the first person to do a book on it because it's such a good story. I mean, it should be a TV documentary.